Afternoon, everybody. It's Thursday. It's Litsoc. Welcome to another fabulous session. And this week we are privileged to have Mr. Sebastian here, who will be talking about Salman Rushdie and particularly about the checkered history of his book, The Satanic Verses. Now, has anybody heard of Salman Rushdie? Yes, a few. There were terrible events over the late summer, and which Mr. Sebastian will talk to us about. And also, particularly, not just about that, but also the fact that Midnight's Children, which was Salman Rushdie's first great novel, which he won the Booker Prize for, Booker of Bookers, in fact, about the partition of India, the independence of India, and that's been much in the people's thoughts because of the Queen's death, and also India's marking her death as a day of mourning, which was very poignant, I thought. Obviously, they're a member of the Commonwealth. So, over to you, Mr. Sebastian. We look forward to this very much. Thank you.
Okay. So, the first thing with Salman Rushdie is... I'm going to stand up, I think. The first thing with Salman Rushdie is that nothing is ever straightforward with Salman Rushdie. He was born in 1947 in Bombay, which is now known as now renamed as Mumbai. And he grew up in India and then moved as a young man, as a child, to rugby school in England, and then went on to Cambridge. Had the beginning of his career in advertising, and then at night he'd be working on his writing. So he had he could have had a very happy life, working in advertising, a little bit in TV. He came up with quite a few advertising slogans that were very popular in the 1980s, like Sainsbury's had "naughty but nice." Was their big thing, and he had developed that. So he could have had a really great career just in copywriting and advertising. But he was really drawn to write, and so he went part-time and then eventually went freelance and devoted as much time as possible to writing these books. But nothing is ever straightforward with him, because you'd think a book that's about the partition of India into India and Pakistan, you would think that in 1947, you'd think that would be a historical novel, or maybe a novel about war and conflict or politics. But instead, the whole thing is couched in magical realism. And in a moment, I'll read you a passage of it. But what really sets Salman Rushdie apart from a lot of other writers, because we've had magical realism writers before, like Angela Carter, for example. But what really marks him out as different is, I would say, his style is almost closer to playwriting. He writes essentially a 500-page long monologue where you'll have a character who is your narrator, who is in character, who is talking to you about a story that's happened, but then will occasionally turn away and talk to someone else in the room at the same time. So throughout Midnight's Children, your narrator occasionally pulls away and has an argument with his wife, who's reading over his shoulder and saying, "No, you've got that all wrong, you need to go back and fix that bit." And he's saying, "Quiet, I know what I'm doing. And all of that gets written in the book. So it's I think James Joyce does something sort of quite similar back in the 1920s. But Salman Rushdie mixes together essentially a very modernist style, postmodernist style, and magical realism. And I would argue as well, theatricality into creating these books. His novels cannot exist as anything but a novel. Anytime it's been put on stage, it's really only a scratch of what it could be. They're impossible to translate into film. And I don't know about you, but anytime I read one of his novels, I picture something close to a painting by Hieronymus Bosch.
Oh, yes, that's a good analogy.
And this would be a good one if I had a screen. So if I had actually thought to do this. But Hieronymus Bosch was a pre-Raphael? Was he? Medieval, yeah. So 500 years ago, 600 years ago, he would do these incredible paintings that would have maybe 60 different people in a marketplace, all doing different things. Some of them pickpockets, some of them lovers, and that's really what these novels are. There are so many characters that he creates this really rich tapestry. Some literal characters, some real political characters, and many magical realism characters. For example, there's a character in here who has incredibly powerful knees, who can kill people with their knees, which is not what you'd kind of expect from a novel that's about the partition of India and Pakistan. But I'm going to read the first page of Midnight's Children just to give you a flavour of what I mean by this writing style of it's as if he's talking to you, like, right there in the moment with you. I was born in the city of Bombay, once upon a time. No, that won't do. There's no getting away from the date. I was born in Dr. Nalikar's nursing home on August 15th, 1947. And the time? The time matters too. Well then, at night. No, it is more important. It's important to be more specific. On the stroke of midnight, as a matter of fact. The clock hands joined palms in respectful greeting as I came. Oh, spell it out, spell it out. At the precise instant of India's arrival at independence, I tumbled forth into the world. There were gasps, and outside the window, fireworks and crowds. A few seconds later, my father broke his big toe, but his accident was a mere trifle when set beside what had befallen me in that benighted moment, because, thanks to the occult tyrannies of those blandly saluting clocks, I had mysteriously been handcuffed to history. My destinies dissolubly changed to those of my country. For the next 3 decades, there was to be no escape. Soothsayers had prophesied me, newspapers celebrated my arrival, politicos ratified my authenticity. I was left entirely without a say in the matter. I, Salim Sinai, later variously called Snot-Nose, Stainface, Baldy, Sniffer, Buddha, and even Piece of the Moon, had become heavily embroiled in fate. At the best of times, a dangerous sort of involvement, and I couldn't even wipe my own nose at the time. Now, however, time, having no further use for me, is running out. I will soon be 31 years old. Perhaps, if my crumbling, overused body permits, I have no hope of saving my life, nor can I count on having even 1,000 nights and a night. I must work fast. Faster, having even 1,000 nights and a night. I must work faster than Scheherazade, if I am to end up meaning something. I admit it. Above all things, I fear absurdity. I could go on for 500 pages, but our narrator here is writing the book as we read it. So by the time you get to the end of the book, he explains his method. I'm not going to spoil the ending for you, but he explains his method and why he's written it and why he's structured in that way, which makes it in the category of a postmodern novel. So he's constantly writing it and then explaining why he's rewritten bits, and then his wife interrupts him and then he explains why he's changed things from what she said. So it's just this, for want of a better word, utterly bonkers writing style that is inimitable. It's if you read a Salman Rushdie, you'll be like, I've never read anything quite like this. It's really unusual. Salim Sinai, our main character, he's born on the stroke of midnight, and he represents India in that moment, and everyone who was born in midnight with him, it's like 1,000 people who are born at literally the exact same moment in India, they all are given some form of superpower. But it doesn't descend into superhero stories. It's all really metaphorical and figurative. And it's really interesting how much of the book really does chart real political events, and then other bits just really completely veer off into this magical world. And a lot of Indian authors and editors have said you couldn't tell the story of India any other way. It's too magical a place to kind of set down in boring history. You've got to include flavour. So that was a book that really made him famous in 1981, but that's not why we're here. 1981, he wrote this, he won the Booker Prize. By 1988, he'd done Shame. He'd written Shame, which we have here. There it is. We had Shame, which is also a great book about the political turmoil in Pakistan after having sort of fought against India, and that sort of continues now. This is quite a dense book to get into as your first Salman Rushdie. You can actually read Shame first and then go back, because that's 500 pages and that's about 261. You can read that one first. But the really controversial one is the Satanic Verses, which comes in 1988. He was so famous by this point, he was given an advance from his publisher of $500,000, or pound, one or the other, I think pounds, £500,000, which in 1987 money would be like being given about £2.2 million before you've even written the book. So he was given a huge amount of money, there was a huge spotlight on him. Everyone was anticipating, what is his next book going to be? Because he wasn't just some author, he was the author of the decade. All eyes of the literary world were on him. And he wrote the Satanic Verses, which its name alone is controversial, because the Satanic Verses references this passage that's in the Quran and in early Islamic history. He was raised Muslim. He's got an interesting relationship with his faith, because he was raised culturally Muslim, somewhat practicing, and at different parts of his life he's either been a practicing Muslim or been happy to identify as culturally Muslim but not a believer. If you know anything about Islam, you know that is actually not a thing. You're not allowed to be just a little bit Muslim. You have to be. It's like, many religions. You have to follow the rules of the religion. Otherwise you're not fully of that faith. So his own interpretation of Islam was already considered controversial. The Satanic Verses is a real thing, a real bit of Islamic scripture, which is it's this debate around something that happened to the Prophet Muhammad. To sum the whole thing up, there's a story about the Prophet Muhammad. He goes to a town and he is attempting to convert them to Islam, because Muhammad, the way that he worked was he went town to town and he converted them to go from polytheism, worshipping many gods, into monotheism, worshipping just Allah. Central to Islam is submission to Allah and peace, and spreading peace. And so in the Quran and in early Islamic historical writings, the Satanic Verses is this moment where the Prophet went to a town and they said to him, "We will convert to your faith if you agree that our three gods that we worship are archangels in your religion. They're not the god, but they are closely related to your god." And the controversy around the Satanic Verses is that one version of the story is that the Prophet said no and turned his back on them, and the other version of the story is that the Prophet said okay, and then the next day, once everyone had converted, he said, actually, the devil poisoned my mind with those surahs, with those lines of text that said that we're allowed to have your gods become angels in our religion. That was not God speaking to me, that was the devil speaking to me. He gave me Satanic Verses, and we should therefore strike that from the record, and we have to go back to your gods are not valid, and there is only one God but Allah. You can see there's a bit of controversy. I appreciate I'm giving you an awful lot of information at the same time, but this becomes really important for then what happens to Salman Rushdie. The story of the Satanic Verses, the history of the Satanic Verses, is already controversial enough. The idea that possibly Muhammad was tempted by the devil to include something that shouldn't be included in the Quran. That's already controversial enough in the Islamic community. So calling a book the Satanic Verses was controversial enough. To make it even more controversial, and I honestly, having read it, I don't quite know why it's in there. There are several interweaving stories in here, and the main story is about two essentially Bollywood actors. One is a performer, and the other one does voices behind the scenes. And it's about their journey to England, and it's a tale of immigration. And in that story, both of them after falling out of a plane, one becomes the image of God, and the other one becomes the image of the devil. And then eventually that fades, and they go back to normal. That's most of the story. But for some reason, there is a chapter in here which is called Mahund, Mahund already sounds a lot like Muhammad. And it's about a 60-page chapter, which is the really controversial bit, in which Salman Rushdie tells the story of the Satanic Verses. But he tells it in English and in detail, fictionalizing it and bringing it to life. And the story he tells is there is a salesman, and he calls him a salesman. There is a salesman who has set up a religion called submission, which is really similar to a translation of the word Islam. He set up this religion called submission, and he's going town to town looking for people to buy into his religion. And then he tells the story of the Satanic Verses just as it's told in Islamic history. But he really makes it clear this is a sales tactic. So that's a deeply offensive thing to Islamic culture. Like, there's no getting away from it. It's not even controversial. It is an offensive thing to do. However, what happened to him beyond that point is the Iranian Ayatollah Khomeini who's he was from 1979. He led an insurrection to take control of the country of Iran and turn it into an Islamic theocracy. This country, Iran, became this became a very, very controversially kind of ultra-Muslim. I don't know if it's technically Sharia law, but it's just very, very by the book, following Islamic law. More controversy of that right now. Incidentally, let's pause for a second. Who knows what's going on in Iran right now with women? Yeah, Marianne?
There's a woman who was visiting from another country called Zina Islami.
Yeah, I can't quite remember the name, yeah.
She was killed after not wearing a hijab properly because a head covering is mandatory in Iran.
Yeah, for women.
Yeah,
and
there's a lot of, and then there's sparked protests, and a lot of people are cutting their hair or burning their hijabs in protest of the mandatory head coverings.
Absolutely. There is a wing of the police called the Modesty Police, and their job is to spot women. You may have noticed earlier today, you would have seen lots of members of staff just checking uniform on the way into school. Imagine if that wasn't just happening at school. Imagine if that was happening just generally out and about. The Modesty Police in Iran, they don't do it all the time, but they go through waves of basically standing out in public places and spotting women who don't have a head covering, don't have a hijab on, and they arrest them and take them away, and they're given a punishment, or they're detained for a little bit to teach them a lesson about being immodest. What happened to? Do you know what happened to her?
Oh yeah, she was arrested and killed.
But she died in suspicious circumstances in police custody. So she was arrested, handcuffed, taken into a van, and then when she emerged, she was dead. And it's very clear what happened to her there in terms of the police arrested her, and then she died while in the hands of the police. Marianne.
It's not just hijab as well. You also have to wear very loose fitting clothing. You can't be able to see the shape of your body, otherwise you are arrested.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the culture even now in 2022. So since 1979, Iran has been under a theocracy where they have followed very, very strict religious political rules as well as religious rules. And the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the ruler of Iran, heard about the Satanic Verses even before it was actually published. Heard about it, and once the minute it was published, he issued a $2 million reward and a fatwa against Salman Rushdie. Basically, he said it's the duty of every Muslim in the world to kill Salman Rushdie, to cleanse the world of Salman Rushdie, because he is spreading poison. That was the idea. And the sweetener was to say you'll get automatic entry into heaven and you'll get $2 million from the Iranian government. And so from 1988, Salman Rushdie immediately had to go into hiding. And there are stories of him having to move 50 times in 2 weeks. So, because there were so many death threats against him. Basically everyone, not every Muslim, that's a ridiculous thing to say, not every Muslim, but so many people respected the Ayatollah Khomeini, or respected their religion, and their principles really deeply, that they thought it is my duty to follow through on this. Not to mention the financial reward would have encouraged many people as well. So from 1988, for years, Salman Rushdie made one public appearance in 1993, went back into hiding. So 5 years, no one saw him, back into hiding. Then another 5 years came out, until eventually, I think, if anyone's seen Bridget Jones's Diary?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
He makes a little appearance in that. He makes a little appearance, I think that's 99 or 2000.
Yeah.
So he would make these little appearances here and there, until eventually the heat kind of cooled on him. There were fewer death threats against him. He had come out of hiding. He still has to be very careful about where he goes. But he's now become a freedom of speech advocate. And so, as well as writing books, so he had a book out here, which is Quixote, in 2018. He's had a number of books. I think he's written 18 novels across his whole career. Bear in mind, Satanic Verses was just the fourth. So he wrote the majority of his novels while in hiding for decades. He missed the birth of his son and didn't really get to spend much time with his son for the first decade of his son's life. So Salman Rushdie has been acutely punished because of attitudes towards freedom of speech. So I suppose the first that's basically my giant introduction to why is he a great artist? Why is he so respected? He's not just some guy who wrote a novel. He is a really exceptionally talented artist. But then the Satanic Verses is an exceptionally controversial moment in the history of freedom of speech. So I suppose my first kind of discussion point for you is what happened to him is obviously not fair. It's not fair to have a fatwa issued against you, to have the possibility of 100 death threats every couple of weeks and have to move around and live in hiding for decades. But do you think what he did was offensive in terms of publishing the Satanic Verses, given how controversial it was with attitudes to do with religious responsibilities and sensibilities in Islam? Do we think that was controversial? And do we think that freedom of speech should be curbed? Or do we think that some level of restriction is appropriate? There we go. So I'm just going to give you, that's a big amount to discuss there. Do we think what happened to Salman Rushdie, do we think it should have been handled differently? Do we think he's entirely in the right? Do we think he's entirely in the wrong? And in terms of your own attitudes towards freedom of speech when it comes to literature, should we be able to write whatever we want, even though we are on the risk of offending other people? Okay, so we'll just spend a couple of minutes talking, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Over to you. To discuss with each other.
Discuss with each other, girls. Cause so, do you think, Emily, like we have on television or Netflix or film, this contains offensive matter?
But what if what you have to say, you think it might be offensive to some people, but it might be educational or beneficial? So go on like a country by country basis. That's quite interesting. But with the internet, boundaries go everywhere. So someone in Iran can access something from anywhere in the world. So banning the publication of the Book of Mormon doesn't make a difference. I should probably I'll mention it when we get back together. I don't know. What happened with Hebrew recently in 2022. But also at the time, in 1948, the people who translated the book into different languages were also attacked. And his Japanese translator was murdered. So even the people who translated the book, even people who published the book, had death threats. So that's an interesting
Paperback and having to go through every security measures to put in and you have to take off the jacket. So like you go through now. And of course in those days, ironically, we didn't have all that. So we just had basically the metal detectors. We didn't have to take our shoes off or anything like that. We had to take off our clothes
Can you run a society based on levels of offence? Because anyone can say that. What proof do you need that it is actually offensive, rather than just some people say, oh, that's offensive, and some people say, oh, it's a great story. So how do we actually draw that line and say what is offensive? So just stay away from anything. Yeah, although that looks kind of, but again, in terms of freedom of speech, I mean, also like he was. I started the whole thing by saying he was. So actually, what?
No.
He is, and his name is Salman. His name is Mohammed Salman Rushdie. Yeah. Like his name is a Muslim name, and so it's not like Adam Jones and his views on Islam. It's definitely
It would here
I don't know. I don't think there are any.
If somebody had attempted, they would have been imprisoned or at least well, they would have had to do it. They would have had to do it without actually making
But also, I think the money would go to their family. So the idea of like, if you're a British Muslim and you killed Salman Rushdie, your family could appeal to the Iranian government to get the money. You'd still, yeah. But you'd also, it's not great. We're going to pull this all together. It had been mentioned earlier by Miss Huntley. In terms of like the stakes we're talking about here, it's 2022, and Salman Rushdie was giving a freedom of speech talk and a talk about his literature, and he was stabbed on stage. That happened this year. That happened this summer. It's still something that haunts him. This isn't something that's gone away. So from 1988 to the present, he's had decades of basically personal persecution because of this book. And I mentioned this group over here. In 1989, his Japanese translator of the Satanic Verses was murdered because of this. So people have had to change address, move house, change their names. Anyone who is involved in the publication of this book has had to look over their shoulder for the rest of their life because of this fatwa issued by the Ayatollah Khomeini. Hopefully they're not watching at home. So where do we get to on discussions of freedom of speech? This group over here was having an interesting discussion about where do we draw the line. Mm-hmm. Do you want to share your ideas?
So it shouldn't be like offensive to people. But the boundary should stop at like religions and nationalities, because you don't really want to offend anybody by where they come from or what they do.
So if we just sort of play things safe and we try not to offend, then we can avoid things like this. Does anybody want to fight in the freedom of speech corner and say what maybe the other side of this is?
Do you know?
Well, I think like in terms of literature, you should be able to like write and publish whatever you want. But maybe on like the cover, it should say this content might be offensive to some people. And so, like, people who read the book are reading it knowing that. So it's not really... and I don't think you should blame the author, because it's, like, their belief, their thoughts. And that's exactly like religion. And you don't kill people because of their religion anymore.
So so you almost put, like, an explicit label, essentially. Or this content might have... A trigger warning label is what that's called. That's really, really interesting. There were thoughts over here. Crystal?
So we discussed that they shouldn't, like, follow him and try to kill him. Or like if they don't like it, they can just ban that author from their religion and just go over it. Or if they're offended, they can just not read that book, not like kind of follow him.
It's really interesting you should say that, not read that book, because quite famously, this book is not that widely read in its entirety. Most people, when they read it, they just read the chapter called Mahund. And so throughout the Iranian government, when they were issuing the fatwa, they didn't... photocopy the entire book and send it round. They just photocopied that chapter and sent it round. And so there were a lot of people where they thought, he's written a book about the Prophet and he's being seditious. That means he's telling lies about the Prophet. Therefore, we'll issue a fatwa against him. They actually read the entire book. They find it's mainly about Bollywood. It's like, it's not... I find it personally very strange. There's a conspiracy theory about this book as well. Do you know this conspiracy theory?
No.
So you remember I mentioned the huge amount of money he was given in advance. Normally writers are given a small advance and then they earn... royalties?
Royalties, yeah.
Off of the number of books sold, they get a percentage of the sales.
Quite a small percentage. You can't live off them unless you're really, really, really best-selling.
One of the conspiracy theories is that the money in the advance that he was given came from like the US government. So and there's actually no evidence to support this, but one of the going conspiracy theories kind of spread by the Iranian government is that that this was Western propaganda designed to destroy Islam. No, like this is coming from people who'd only read one chapter, so there's not really a lot of basis for that one. But it kind of tells you the level of blindness to this. So if we go back to what Crystal said about, like, only people who've just steer clear of that book, or only read it if you want to read that book. The problem with this book is there were people who were against it who hadn't even read it, or if they had read it, they'd only read part of it. And so that's one of the key issues with freedom of speech is people often have an opinion about stuff they haven't even actually done the basic reading on. Marianne, your table having a good discussion.
What?
Yeah, about freedom of speech. Where do you think the line is?
Well, I definitely think definitely on social media and stuff, there should definitely be some moderation. But in literature, it's very different because you can just not read the book.
Yes.
So I get that it is deeply offensive to some people, and I get that a lot of people, as you said, just kind of, they didn't read the whole book, so they don't understand it properly. But I also think that the Islamic government could have just not sent out like a death threat to this guy, because that's a bit far, you know.
Yeah.
It's a bit, you know. Let's not kill people because of their ideologies. That's something that's always gone wrong. Like, people used to kill so many minorities because of who they were or what they believed in, and that's never gone. That's always changed. People's beliefs have always changed because of that, you know. So it's never good to kill someone for what they believe in.
Yeah. Interestingly, in Islam there are a handful of it's a religion of peace, but there are a handful of reasons to issue some sort of fatwa or jihad or holy war, and the number one reason is when something represents a threat against the faith. So that was their argument was this book is a threat against the faith. Everyone who reads it will be turned against Islam, so it's our responsibility. He is the aggressor. He's the one who drew first blood. He struck first. We are the ones who are trying to level the playing field. So, I mean, they've got a bit of a victim complex there. They're kind of seeing themselves as the persecuted rather than the persecutors.
Of course, it's not unique, is it? I mean, we had Charlie Hebdo in Paris, the cartoon that they published, and there was a massacre at the offices of the magazine. Do you remember, Miss Kears? And then a Danish cartoonist drew a picture of Muhammad. Now, Muhammad is not supposed to be represented in Muslim. There's no figures in Muslim religion at all, and he suffered death threats. So it's not unique, but it's certainly the most ongoing one, isn't it? Long-going, yes. Yeah.
Any final thoughts? Should we broaden this to other books that have been banned and why? I have to disappear because I have to pick up a child. But I'm going to hand you back to Miss Huntley.
Okay.
Other books that have been banned.
Other books that have been banned. I want to talk first of all about this one, Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury. You heard of this? Anybody? You read it, Hannah? Yes. Holly, have you read it? No? Josie?
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it.
You've heard of it, yeah. Okay. It's a very famous book because Guy Montag is a fireman. He's the main character. And it's a science fiction book, but it's sadly all too real in a lot of cases. He's a fireman. What do firemen normally do? What do they normally do? Crystal?
Save people from the fire.
They save people from a fire, don't they? And then what else do they do besides saving people? Do you know?
Put out the fire.
They put out the fires, yes, absolutely. The premise on this book is that, of this story, is that he doesn't put out fires, he starts fires. And he starts fires, I wonder if you can guess what he burns. Can you guess what he burns?
People.
Not people. Not people. Books. He burns books. Books that are banned. This is this hideous society, this dystopia. And Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which paper burns. It's a very high temperature. You wouldn't think it was quite as high as that, would you, in some ways? Anyway, he changes. In the course of the book, he changes and begins to think, well, maybe I should be actually reading these banned books. What is it that makes them unique? What should I explore them? And he goes to people's houses. I mean, can you imagine? You've got books in your house, you don't think anything about it, or a library like this, and one day the firemen arrive. But they're not here to help you with the smoke alarms or, how to protect your goods or have you got enough house insurance? No, they're here to take them out, put them in the quad and burn them. Okay? And Ray Bradbury, of course, was reimagining terrible societies where this had happened. This was actually written in 1954, so pretty much 9 years after the end of the Second World War. Of course, the end of the Second World War meant the end of which society? Which society was defeated? Do you know?
The Nazis?
The Nazis in Germany. Of course, the Nazis were notorious for banning books, hating painting if it didn't go with their set principles, and so Bradbury's sort of rethinking a different sort of society, not necessarily as all-controlling as Nazi Germany, but in some ways perhaps even worse, because of it trying to control thought. So that's about banning books. Mariam's lent us To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, you're reading it, aren't you?
Yes.
3 of you read it? Anybody else read it? Why might it have been banned, do you think?
Because it's all about racism. So I think it might have been banned because of that reason.
Because of that reason? Yes, absolutely. Marianne, any ideas? It's a good answer. Any other ideas why it might have been banned?
Well, like the racism, and also because there's like Atticus, he's very against the whole, and Scout gets very confused by this because she's like, oh, but you can just say you were assigned by the court to this case. You can say that you don't want to defend Tom Robinson. You have to. But Atticus is like, no, because that's, and it's very combating against racism. It's not just about racism. It's saying that you shouldn't. But the main character is you shouldn't have racism.
Yes, that everybody's equal, and certainly equal before the law, even if nowhere in the courtroom, even if nowhere else. Yes, absolutely. Also, because this was written at a time in the 1960s where the African American community did not have full rights, they were fighting for them. So again, in some of the states of the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, it was a very controversial text. So there's that one. This one too, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain. You might have read Adventures of Tom Sawyer. This too was banned, again in the Deep South, because Huck Finn, who's a great character, he has a friend who's a slave, a runaway slave called Jim. And again, when Mark Twain wrote this, I think we were barely out of slavery being abolished, but still we had racist laws in America, and very controversial. And Huck is white, he's poor white, but he gets to know Jim as an equal and a friend, and of course, you know, that's again very controversial. So well worth seeking that out as well. Roald Dahl the Witches. Now, do you want to talk about that? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so don't think that children's books are safe from
No.
From the censor. So The Witches. I mean, you probably could take a guess why this one was banned. Why do you think this one was banned?
Because it's got a lot of things in it, like the witches who take the children, and it doesn't really, like, because it's a children's book aimed at young children, it doesn't really teach them that there are good things in the world.
Precisely. It's not teaching wholesome lessons. It's teaching these sort of like, you know, weird, wacky, wonderful, well, not wonderful, but, you know, sinister creatures. And of course, that's part of the appeal of Roald Dahl. We're all Roald Dahl fans in here, right? We've all read Roald Dahl, and there's all these like larger than life characters, but it's like it's taking away the wonder. It's saying, no, this is not a wholesome thing to be teaching children. And so that's why these wonderful stories have been banned. The Witches being one example. I can bring an example closer to us. When I first started here, we had an author come in, just starting out, by the name of James Dawson. Now has become Juno Dawson. And he had a debut book called Hollow Pike, which also featured witches. And I sent a letter home to parents, say, oh, you know, we got this author coming in. And I mentioned the basic plot of the book, the basic premise featured witches. And I got some complaints back saying, well, you know, we're a church school, I'm not sure we should be promoting witchcraft, if you can believe it. So it is something that happens. I can think of an even more recent example. This is very pertinent to those of you who are... anyone here in the LGBTQ plus society? Or Marianne? Or, you know, I'm sure some of you will have heard it if you're not in it. around about World Book Day, a school tries to get an author in who happens to be gay, and the group, because we're part of a group here, we're part of United Learning, the group that this school was part of, they tried to basically cancel that author visit. They didn't want it to happen because they thought it was spreading an unwholesome message. So it's so as a librarian, because books are my trade, I'm very acutely conscious that I'm at the vanguard of the censorship issue. And libraries should not be places where ideas are shut down. It should be places where knowledge is shared and ideas are celebrated. Because books are vessels; they're like portals for ideas. And that's why we have 14,000 books in here, because I want these books. I want to open your mind, open your thinking, open your ideas. And if we talk back to the free speech debates, yes, of course, there's free speech versus hate speech, and there needs to be limits about offending people. But when it comes to sort of disagreeing with people, the answer is not to no platform people on Twitter or to shut them down. You should argue with them, show them using logic to sort of show them the error of their ways, because there's the sliding scale of, if I disagree with someone, how do I argue well? The worst thing you can do is call them a name, reduce it to childishness. And then there's a sliding scale of, you might do something like attack the person. So perhaps Salman Rushdie was attacked as a person for who they were rather than what they were saying. And then the best thing you can do is just take their argument and provide evidence, back it up to refute that argument. So that's where I stand on the free speech. And books are the best, or some of the best vessels to do exactly that, to disseminate those things, those arguments. So yeah, there you go. I started talking about the witches and I went into a much bigger chat.
Well, it is a big thing, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
English Pen is a very big organisation. It looks after and helps authors across the world who might have been censored or banned. There are places like Turkey, Pakistan, India, Iran, Iraq, who do censor authors, imprison them, and English Pen and other organisations called Pen across the world look after them and help their families. Salman Rushdie was quite a famous proselytiser for this, wasn't he? And many authors take part in discussions and raise money for English Pen as well. And it can happen in a heartbeat. It just depends. I mean, for example, we know, don't we, that in the United States of America, in some states, women are having a very hard time, particularly with birth rights, for example, the right to have an abortion. And it's becoming now the right to have birth control as well. There are innumerable books about this sort of topic, illegitimate babies, how people coped, etc. Again, one can see, can't you, that the writing will be on the wall and books will be removed. In The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments, Margaret Atwood paints a horrific picture of a place where women don't have full rights. They certainly aren't supposed to be able to read. And again, books of a certain nature. For example, just thinking about something like Jane Eyre, where we have a very feisty heroine who gets involved with a married man and then goes back to him before she knows that he's not married anymore. And it's that sort of book, isn't it, that one can imagine. And of course it's the same with films and television programmes as well. And don't think it can't happen here, because if we don't keep an eye on it, it could happen, and it could happen really easily. I know we think that Britain is a place of great freedom, and it is, but it only takes one person, one decision.
I just gave you that example of that school,
yes,
for instance.
Yes, yeah. That it's not suitable here. I had a similar experience at an open day long time ago, where we weren't teaching Harry Potter, but we had it in the library, and it was out along with Alan Garner, and I had a couple of parents say, I'm not sure that they're really suitable for Year 7, and you had to argue the case. The most popular books of the early 2000s, and why not? It's just a story. But of course, stories have legs and they run, and ideas. And again, when you think You know, even Charlotte's Web. I can't remember why was Charlotte's Web banned. Can you remember?
I think it might have been Miss Rio was looking at the Daily. Can you remember Miss Rio?
It was something to do with the fact that the animals could talk.
Yeah.
The animals could talk, right? So it's not realistic.
Again, deviates from
Yes,
Juno.
realism. Juno.
So I was googling what banned books, and is that some parents thought that, I can't remember what religion it was, but they felt that only the humans had the right to talk in the book, and of course in the book the animals talk, so they thought it was a problem.
Yeah. Wait till they watch Green Planet and find out that mushrooms and fungi can have extraordinary powers. We'll be really in trouble. David Attenborough will be banned too.
No. Never.
So, no, we hope not. So it's worth seeking out, and even the most sort of, you know, I suppose to some extent, maybe even Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe was in itself controversial at a time. Lord of the Rings, because they're different worlds where there are different powers, and certainly, I should think in the far Christian right, Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe is.
Yeah. Again, it's just going against the sort of like conventional narrative, the conventional conservative.
Yes.
This is how things are.
Yeah.
So that's what scares people.
So we started with Salman Rushdie, who is well, but
Yeah.
a bit,
Thankfully.
at the moment, and we've moved to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, to Kill a Mockingbird, back to Charlotte's Web, Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter. It was a good place to finish. Thank you, everybody. Thanks
Thank
for
you very
coming,
much.
and thank you for your
See you next week.
contributions.
Thank you.